Okay, so this is the second part of this week's lecture. This one is titled The Research Process. Now, we've already talked about how the goals of social research are to define knowledge, develop knowledge, and to explain the world that we live in. So I won't go into that anymore. But what we can say about the study of social life is that we are looking at human beings as both individuals and populations. We are examining human behavior to understand and predict why people or groups do the things that they do. And we're collecting data about various aspects of the human social life to create theories and laws in this regard. And once these theories and laws are formulated, we then try to establish the interrelationship between these facts. Now, the objectives of social research are dedicated to the welfare of humanity. And what we mean by that is that we are trying to use science to benefit humanity, all of humanity, regardless of what social positions that they hold. We also use social research to classify facts and to clarify those facts and to organize them in ways that are meaningful. And lastly, we use it to predict and for measures of social control. The main point of research is to be able to make predictions about how individuals would act under certain circumstances and conditions. So, having certain beliefs might lead them to seek out one treatment over another. For instance, certain religious groups do not believe in going to the doctor at all. So, how do we as public health scientists face that and help them stay healthy? Now, the first thing that you need to understand about any science is that any attempt to classify research types is purely arbitrary. And this is because most research will have elements of all the things that I'm about to talk about. So let's talk about how we classify things. So first, we classify data based on whether it is qualitative or quantitative. And we're going to talk more about this next week. We also talk about the purpose of the research, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but we talk about whether it is applied or theoretical. Then we talk about the process or the approach of research. So for instance, is it deductive or inductive reasoning? Then we focus on whether we're trying to find theoretical outcomes or empirical outcomes. And lastly, we talk about the type of analysis that we'll be carrying out. So are we just giving descriptive statistics? In other words, are we talking about what percent of the population has a disease? Or are we giving analytical descriptions, which would then be, are they probabilistic or causal? So are we trying to predict how certain conditions might lead to an increase in a disease, and whether or not those conditions are just correlated or are they a causal factor. Basic research is called pure research. So whenever we say, we're conducting basic research, what we could be saying is that we're conducting pure research. We'll talk about on the next slide what that means. Research is undertaking to improve our understanding of the problems that commonly occur in society, as well as give us ideas of how we might solve those problems. We undertake this for the sole purpose of adding to our knowledge, and that knowledge is typically fundamental and more general in nature. Now, basic research may not have an immediate or a planned application. In other words, it may just be very theoretical. So if we think about some of my research on guns and how guns relate to happiness, there's no actual applied nature to that research. What it does is it contributes to the formation of theory, and this is what I do in my research. Now, basic research is what we conduct at the academic level. This is done by professors, by scholars, by other researchers. And it is devoted to generating new knowledge in a particular area of interest. Now, this is why another name for theoretical research is fundamental research. Theoretical research is essentially an intellectual exercise. And what that means is that we are thinking about the world that we live in and trying to understand how certain aspects of society interact with each other to produce outcomes. It explains these phenomena as they are and not as they should be, and may verify or establish a new phenomena. In other words, it doesn't always have immediate practical uses. Applied research, on the other hand, is undertaken in response to a social problem. This means we're looking for a solution. Now, the major purpose is to answer both practical and useful questions, and it is often taken from that theoretical research that we just talked about on the last slide. Applied research is concerned with knowledge that has an immediate application, and so it's also called decisional research. Now, it's used as an aid to policy and in planning, and it has been growing in importance both at the government and the business sector for decades because it is usually used as the basis for nearly all government policies in our economic system. So, in this context, this type of research becomes an important tool for policy making decisions. Another way to kind of think of this is that theoretical research is concerned with understanding the root causes of phenomena, while applied research attempts to make this theory useful in a real life situation. So, when we think about what do we do, a question could be asked, well, what do public health scientists do? Are we doing applied research or are we doing theoretical research? When we think about some examples, if we look at the basic research, which is the theoretical research, the difference in the amount and types of housework engaged in by men and women, dating norms among college students, the effects of college education on health in later life, reasons for racial differences in college major choice. All of these are theoretical ideas, and they don't really have an applicable solution to solving any of the disparities that we might see in them. On the other hand, applied research examples include things like the evaluation of how time spent at a school's new tutoring center affects the grades. You can see how time spent at that tutoring center and then grade outcomes can be linked, and we can see that if more time spent at the tutoring center maybe improves grades, that there would be a push to get more students to attend the tutoring center. In the second one, reasons why some homeless youth are not using services they are eligible for. Once we understand the services that they're not using and why they're not using it, we can change how we market those services so that they begin to use them more. And lastly, differences in test scores when using different teaching methods. Once we figure out which teaching method provides the most benefit, we could switch to that teaching method and make sure that all students are getting the best possible scores. So now let's talk about the two different approaches to research. Now, most of you are probably familiar with deductive research. This is the scientific method as you have seen it, where you work from hypotheses to theories. What we are going to do in this class is inductive social research or grounded research. So we start with general ideas or theories and we develop these from specific observations. So for example, in inductive research, a researcher finds that some specific religious minorities tend to favor a specific political view. They may then extrapolate this to a hypothesis that all religious minorities tend to have the same political views. But in deductive research, we start with the opposite. We would start with the hypothesis that religious affiliation influenced political views, and then we would begin to make observations to prove or disprove this hypothesis. Now, as I said, this class is primarily focused on inductive reasoning because inductive reasoning is most commonly associated with qualitative research methods, while deductive reasoning is more commonly associated with quantitative methods. And this is always true 100% of the time, but this is where it usually falls. The focus of social research is considered theoretical when we are concerned with developing, exploring, or testing ideas that we have about how the world operates. It is considered empirical when the research is based on observations and measurements of reality. So think about how we perceive the world around us. Social research attempts to create and validate theories through data collection and data analysis. So our goal is to explore the world around us, describe the world around us, and then explain the world around us. How we choose to analyze our data really depends on the questions that you're asking, and it determines the methods that you use. So some methodologies are much better at answering questions than others, and we'll talk more about that in later lectures. For now, let's think about it in terms of descriptives and analytics. Descriptive analysis tell us things like who is affected, what is going on, when did it happen, and where did it happen. So for instance, what group is more likely to catch this disease, when was the disease most prominent, and where was this disease most prominent. Analytic analyses, on the other hand, answer questions about how and why. Okay, not always in deep detail though. This is why we use qualitative analyses, and this is where they come into play to help us further explain those how and why questions. When we are doing analytical work, we are probably conducting some form of probabilistic or causal analyses. Now, most of the work we do in public health is probabilistic or based in probabilities. We infer from these probabilities the impact on the greater society. This means that they are seldom meant to cover laws that pertain to all cases. Instead, we are developing theories about what the most likely scenarios could be and how diseases may spread based on how certain factors play a role in either containing or spreading a disease. In social research, we use statistics to estimate the probabilities for those situations. So, for instance, if we look at my paper on gun ownership and fear, we were attempting to understand, do gun owners have more fear than non-gun owners, and whether fear could predict whether someone would buy a gun and become a gun owner. Now, social research is at some point interested in cause-effect relationships. So we do look for causal relationships when we can, but this is most often left to the clinical side of epidemiology. So we are often using it to understand how causes, such as programs or treatments, affect outcomes like diseases. So thinking about the COVID vaccine and how it impacted the spread of COVID. In science, we talk about the scientific method, but in reality, the scientific method has 9 basic steps. So let's talk about these briefly, and then we'll go through a scenario. There are 9 basic steps that we're going to discuss in this class. The first is that we have to understand that there is a problem. We have to realize that a problem exists. Then we have to identify that problem. Next, we have to create a theoretical framework of why this problem could exist. Then we develop hypotheses to support that theory. Then we decide on what our research design should look like. Then we collect data. Then we analyze data. Then we interpret and generalize our findings. And lastly, we publish our findings. Okay, so let's imagine that we're trying to solve the following problem. We want to know whether or not divorce affects children differently than adults when it comes to their health. So what do we do? Well, the first step is to sense or realize a problem. Do we think that children are affected differently? If we do, and if there's evidence for that, that is our sensing that there's a problem. So then we identify that problem, specifically looking at the health of the children versus the health of the adults. So we've already completed the first 2 steps. The next step is to identify a theoretical framework. So in this step, we choose a methodology. Now, we have to distinguish between what I mean by a method and a methodology. A method is a way to collect data. So we're going to use either surveys or experiments or interviews. A methodology, on the other hand, is a philosophical perspective on how research should be conducted. This is closely tied to theory. Science is typically grounded in a positivist methodology, meaning that grounded principles of logic, objectivity, and replicability are inherent in our methodologies. This methodology will then affect every single aspect of our research process. Once we have a methodology, we then have to decide, okay, what is going to be our research question? Now, to come up with research questions, we usually just get a broad topic and we realize, from that topic, we have to refine it down to be a more manageable question. But this is where we start realizing there's a problem and we begin to identify that problem. And this topic can come from experiences that you've had or the experiences of someone you know. It may be something that you want to understand more about, like understanding political movements, like the paper of mine on Gamergate. So in other words, there are an infinite number of sources of inspiration for research questions, and research questions guide your research, and the methodology you choose is based on the nature of the question that you asked. Now, writing a good question takes a lot of practice because you have to learn how to write it in a well-worded way, in a way that is precise and is clear. You should not have to explain your research question after you write it. It should also be concise and grammatically correct. So you would want a shorter question over a longer question. Generally, it is better to stay away from multiple research questions or subparts because this makes it not concise or clear. So instead, consider broadening your question so that a single question covers your interest. Now, rarely do we write a usable research question right off the top of our heads. Typically, we'll write a draft of a paper and we'll rewrite that question over and over and over as we continue to conduct the research. And one of the first places that we begin to refine that research question actually happens when we conduct a literature review. A literature review is a concise, summative critique of everything we know about a topic. It's not just saying this researcher said this or this researcher said that. It is synthesizing information into a coherent understanding of what we know and what we don't know. So what you often find when you're doing a lit review is that maybe a dozen or 24 people have already answered the question you were interested in. And that can be disheartening to some degree, but it should also then show that your research topic was valid and that people want to understand it. So what you can do is go to those papers that answered your question, go to their discussion section and look at what questions still need to be answered, because often there is a limitation section, and in that it says future research should look at X and Y. This will often give you ideas for other papers that you can write. Another component of this is ethics, and we're going to talk a lot about ethics in this class. Ethics is a way of making sure that we are protecting the people who are in our studies. So anytime we do human research, we have to get the approval of the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. The IRB exists to make sure that we are protecting the rights of our subjects. Now, when we talk about ethics later in the semester, you'll see why the IRB is necessary. Federal law actually determines the rules of the IRB, and one of the most important aspects of the IRB is informed consent. What does that even mean? Well, it means that your respondent knows enough about what you're trying to do that they can give you an accurate answer as to whether or not they want to participate in your study. Now, once we figured out our ethics and our research question, we then have to figure out where are we even getting our data. So when we think about data, first we have to figure out what our population is. So what if we wanted to study people in Tallahassee to find out, again, going back to that original question about divorce affecting the health of children and adults. So we are looking at the city of Tallahassee. We get our sample from the population because it's not possible to ask every single person in Tallahassee about their health or their childhood and to find out whether or not divorce changed their health outcomes. So instead, we draw a sample that is representative of the people living in Tallahassee. So we could collect that by saying we're going to interview 500 people in the city of Tallahassee about their childhood and whether or not their parents divorced, and then looking at their health today as adults, and we could do the same for children and adults. The size of your sample is often dictated by your methodology. What that means is that quantitative research can typically get more respondents because the questions don't require a lot of nuance when you ask them. So for instance, a quantitative question may be something like, how strongly do you agree or disagree with the following statement? And then everyone answers that they either strongly agree, neither agree or disagree, or strongly disagree. In qualitative research, though, you're often asking people open-ended questions where they can give you things from their life that kind of explain why they feel the way that they do. Now, once we figure all of that out, we then have to figure out how do we conceptualize our data and how do we operationalize our data. So what this means is, how do we imagine a variable should look or a question should look, and then how do we make that work the way that we want it to. So let's think about the following question. We want to know how much sexually explicit content a person is exposed to on television every week. Now, our research question is simply that, but think about the word sexually explicit. What does that mean? Now, when we think about conceptualizing and operationalizing variables, we do this both before and after collecting data because we refine these terms in order to make sure we're actually capturing what we want to capture. In other words, we want to make sure that the questions that we're asking actually answer the questions that you're interested in. So going back to that sexually explicit material, how do you define that? What counts as sexually explicit material? Because some groups may say any form of sexual contact, whether it's just kissing or saying I love you, could be sexually explicit. Whereas other groups may say unless it is hardcore pornography, it's not sexually explicit. So how do you define it in order to make sure that what you consider sexually explicit is actually captured in that measure? Once we've collected the data, it is now time to analyze the data. So we collect the data through our interview processes or other methods, and then we begin to analyze it. And this is the most consuming part of research, especially the collecting of data. Thinking about interviews, let's say that we wanted to interview 100 people on a topic. How long would it take you to interview them? Also keep in mind the average interview is about an hour to an hour and a half. Think about 100 people and just the time it takes to do the interview, not counting the time it takes to find them, go to them, meet them, do the interview, and then return to your house. And then once you get all of the data, you then have to analyze it. And that is also time consuming because now you have to make it make sense. And unlike quantitative research, where you're just asking a question, as I mentioned before, that's answered in strongly agree to strongly disagree, you have to read through everything that a person told you and analyze it for themes. Now, the last part of what we talked about is publishing findings, okay? This is super important because if you don't publish the things you find, you are not a scientist. You are just simply doing a hobby. The reason for this is simple. Think about the papers that I've published. Much of my research is null findings. What that means is that I find no difference between one group and another group when it comes to an outcome. Now, thinking about the Guns and Happiness paper that I published and how gun owners are not any happier or less happy than non-gun owners. Let's say I didn't publish that. What happens then a few months down the road when someone else has that same question? They want to know, do guns make people happy? So they do the research. Then they find that there is no difference between gun owners and non-gun owners, and they also don't publish it. How long before the next person comes along and says, oh, hey, I want to study this. And then they find the same thing and they don't publish it, and so on and so forth. How much time is lost trying to answer a question that someone already knew the answer to? If we had just published it, then people would know that this answer has been given, and so they would move on to new questions related to it. Okay, so this is where we're going to stop this week. Make sure you do the discussion post by Thursday at 11:59 p.m. and then respond to at least 2 of your peers by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. and also do the reflection that is posted on Canvas. Have a great rest of your week. If you have any questions, reach out to your TA, and I will see you next week.